Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to our Sunday school class on critical race theory and anti-racism. I need to mention up front that this week I goofed up. When I gave the lesson this morning at church, I forgot to format the USB drive before hitting the record button on our lesson. So the Sunday school lesson did not record this morning, so this is a post-lesson recording that I'm doing on my own after church today. But I'm going to summarize the gist of what we covered in church this morning, and I'll also do my best to summarize some of the questions and comments from members of the class today. But this will be our 7th lesson in the series, and as I've said in previous lessons, I'm summarizing my definition of critical race theory in terms of 3 core tenets or 3 key principles. Now, if you look at the primary literature on critical race theory, a number of definitions are offered, a number of lists of core principles. Some of those lists would be as many as like 5 or 6 core principles, or perhaps even like 10 or even 12 core principles. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm reducing that number down to 3 because I think that these are 3 of the key principles that receive the most attention in discussions today on critical race theory. Now, in our previous lesson, we talked about the issue of systemic racism, but today we'll be focusing on the idea of structural determinism. And I'm guessing that most people these days have heard the term systemic racism quite frequently, but they're probably not as familiar with this concept of structural determinism. And my goal with this lesson is to help remedy that. I want to draw more attention to this notion of structural determinism because it's very central to the teaching of critical race theory and anti-racism. I think it lies at the heart of the anthropology that underlies CRT and anti-racism. That is, it's the doctrine of human nature that is promoted by CRT and anti-racism. And my definition of structural determinism, which is based on a reading of the primary sources, would be this. It's the idea that oppressive social structures are the primary source of unequal group outcomes. And so that would be the foundation for our notions of privilege and disadvantage, as those terms are frequently used in contemporary discourse. Now, perhaps the best way to describe structural determinism would be to begin with an illustration of it. And so for that purpose, I'm using a book that was published over 20 years ago. It's called Divided by Faith by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith. Now, this is a work of history and sociology, where these authors are analyzing white evangelical views on race and racial inequalities in American society today. And this is a very good book. There's a lot of really good material in it, but they are very critical of the prevailing white evangelical understandings of racial inequality in America today. Their research has shown that most white evangelicals in America understand racial inequality in terms of 3 key ideas. Those 3 key ideas would be accountable free will individualism, relationalism, and anti-structuralism. Now, accountable free will individualism refers to the idea that if a person succeeds or fails in society, that is primarily a result of their own personal choices. It's a result of their own personal character, their own values. And so it understands racial inequalities in very individualistic terms. The second principle, relationalism, has to do with the idea popular among white evangelicals that the solution to racial inequalities today is to have healthy relationships within one's life. It's a matter of having a healthy family life. It's about having responsible friends and also being active in, say, the local church. So having the right relationships within one's life will have a positive effect on the outcomes within a person's life. Now, the third element would be this idea of anti-structuralism, which is the general skepticism of white evangelicals towards top-down policies aimed at economic or political or legal structures in society. And so those 3 key ideas are expressed by most white evangelicals today in their understanding of the causes of racial inequality. And Emerson and Smith are critical of those ideas. And to demonstrate or to illustrate why they're critical of those ideas, they offer this parable. So I'm going to read this parable for us today, which is taken as an excerpt from their book, Divided by Faith. Both Meridel and Parker were overweight, to the point of being unhealthy. They decided it was the time to do something drastic. Responding to an ad for a Fat Away program, they drove to a rural area in their state, where they were taken to separate areas of the woods. For 6 weeks, they would be locked into these compounds, as they were called. In each compound, according to the ad, were the perfect ingredients needed to lose weight. Their goal was to each lose 40 pounds. What they did not know is that the less than ethical Fat Away organization was really a research laboratory studying the effects of various diets, exercise programs, and weight loss expectations on people's weight change. Without a word to Meridel or Parker, they placed Meridel in a compound designed to help her lose weight, but they placed Parker in a compound designed for Parker to gain weight. In Meridel's compound were running trails, a swimming pool, state-of-the-art exercise equipment, a basketball court, and a sauna. In her cabin were magazines on proper nutrition, instructional videos on how to lose weight, an abundance of natural, healthy, low-fat, low-calorie foods, and no sweets. Each day she was greeted early by fit and trim people who asked Meridel to go on a run with them, talked about how much they loved being thin, and encouraged her that she too can be thin. Wonderful conditions for losing weight. In Parker's compound was only a tiny cabin. No exercise equipment was available whatsoever, but there were plenty of videos and movies that showed high-calorie foods looking sumptuous, more high-calorie goodies than even a sumo wrestler could desire, and just a few fruits and vegetables. The only other people Parker saw were also obese, and though they talked about losing weight, they seemed not to really care about their weight. Not good conditions for losing weight. The program called for each participant to weigh in at the start, and then every 2 weeks thereafter. At the end of 2 weeks, with neither aware of what was inside the other's compound, Meridel and Parker were taken to the weighing room. They each took their turn on the scale. Meridel stepped on the scale first. She had lost 19 pounds. Parker's turn produced far less excitement. He actually gained 2 pounds. Meridel, who assumed that both she and Parker had the same type of compound, was irritated with Parker. "We paid good money to be here, Parker. How can you waste it? You have to exercise. You have to eat right." Parker tried to make his case, but it only made Meridel more irritated. Meridel told Parker he needed to try harder. Parker, though he was depressed about his weight gain and the difficulty in exercising adequately and eating right, resolved to do so. But try as he may, Parker kept eating too many bad foods, and he exercised very little. He became depressed, and his depression only made him eat more and exercise less. After another 2 weeks, back he and Meridel went to the scales. Meridel, with wonderful weight loss opportunities, and taking full advantage of them, lost another 15 pounds. Parker, however, actually gained more weight than he had the first 2 weeks. Meridel could not believe what Parker was doing to himself. "Don't you know why we're here? Parker, this place is designed for us to lose weight. If you can't do it here, where can you?" "I don't think this is all that great a place to lose weight," Parker sniped. "The food here is fatty, and exercising is next to impossible." Meridel was taken aback. Finally, she replied, "It wouldn't matter if that were true, Parker. When we get home, the food can be fatty and exercise difficult, but you must learn to eat and exercise right, regardless." Parker, increasingly frustrated by Meridel's comments, retorted, "No way is it as easy as you're making it seem. I think Fat Away is treating me unfairly. I'm not even sure I want to lose weight." With that, Meridel was dumbfounded. If Parker was not even going to try, if he was going to blame others, perhaps he deserved to be obese. But she also thought that if only Parker could have a vision of what he could look like, he would take advantage of Fat Away and lose weight. She encouraged Parker to imagine being thin, toned, and healthy. "Wouldn't it be wonderful, Parker, if only you would try?" Back they went for another 2 weeks. At the final weigh-in, with the predictable result of Parker not having lost weight, Meridel simply resigned herself to the idea that Parker wanted to be overweight. Why Parker would want this, she was not sure, but of one thing she was sure. Until Parker decided he wanted to lose weight, he would not. Meridel is partially correct in her final assessment. Parker will not lose weight unless he tries. His attitude will have to improve. He needs a vision, a goal, and the motivation to get there. But she misses the vast difference in environments that render the correlation between individual initiative and outcome far less than perfect. Due to structural differences, only a very few with incredible willpower could possibly lose weight in an environment like Parker's. And likewise, in an environment like Meridell's, only a very few could possibly gain weight. So what we see in this parable by Emerson and Smith is a critique of the popular evangelical understandings of accountable free will individualism, relationalism, and anti-structuralism. Now, they don't use the term, but what Emerson and Smith are promoting is the idea of structural determinism. Now, let me define how that term is used by critical race theory scholars themselves. If you look at the introductory textbook on CRT by Delgado and Stefanczyk, they define it in this way. Imagine a painter raised by parents and preschool teachers who teach him that the world contains only 3 colors, red, blue, and yellow. Or a would-be writer who is raised with an artificially low vocabulary of 300 words. Children raised in smoggy Mexico City are said to paint pictures with a brownish yellow, never blue sky. These examples point out the concept that lies at the heart of structural determinism, the idea that our system, by reason of its structure and vocabulary, is ill-equipped to redress certain types of wrong. And then if you look at the glossary of this book, they define structural determinism as a concept that a mode of thought or a widely shared practice determines significant social outcomes, usually without our conscious knowledge. So that, in a nutshell, is the idea of structural determinism. Now I want to ask the question, where did this idea come from? And you can trace it back to various Enlightenment-era thinkers. I've talked about Jean-Jacques Rousseau in this series before, but I think one of the most relevant earlier precursors of the notion of structural determinism was Karl Marx. And back then, he promoted an idea that's been called material determinism, very closely related to structural determinism. And if you read his Communist Manifesto, which he published in 1848, him and Friedrich Engels, they have this to say. So I'm going to read an excerpt from the Communist Manifesto. And keep in mind that this manifesto is addressed to the bourgeoisie, and they are critiquing bourgeois values and bourgeois society and trying to defend their idea of a communist revolution. So here's what they say to the bourgeoisie. But don't wrangle us so long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeois property the standard of your bourgeois notions of freedom, culture, law, etc. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economical conditions of existence of your class. Now, you may remember from previous lessons of ours, we talked about how Marxist theory understands society in terms of base and superstructure. The base of society, according to Marx, is believed to be the economic relations of society, so the relations of production and wealth. Who are the haves and who are the have-nots? And that base determines every other feature of society, which would be the superstructure. So whether that's law or education or religion or art or entertainment, all of that is shaped by economic forces, and that's why this is called material determinism. We've also talked about how Marxism was transformed in the 20th century under the thinking of Antonio Gramsci, the Frankfurt School, and other neo-Marxists. And what they did, and this is the move towards cultural Marxism, is they took the base superstructure paradigm and kind of turned that on its head. They recognized that the structures within culture exert just as much of a causal influence on society as the economic base. And so that really gives us the foundation for this idea of structural determinism, which is very much connected to material determinism, but goes beyond that in identifying various legal, political, and social structures as determinants upon society as well. Now, when we look at how this discussion impacted discussions on race in American society, I want us to look back at two contrasting visions of racial progress. Now, you'll see on this slide a picture of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And these two individuals in the early 20th century represent these two contrasting visions of what would be necessary for racial progress in America. Booker T. Washington's focus was on personal character and socioeconomic uplift, so that would be the tradition of thinkers like Thomas Sowell or the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. And contrasted with that would be the view of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the founder of the NAACP and is often considered to be the philosophical godfather of critical race theory. Now, in his book, Please Stop Helping Us, the author Jason Riley describes the difference between these two individuals. He writes, "For more than a century, black leaders have tangled with one another over whether to pursue economic independence or focus their energies on integrating political, corporate, and educational institutions. W.E.B. Du Bois, author of the groundbreaking 1903 treatise, The Souls of Black Folk, argued for the latter, while his contemporary, Booker T. Washington, said political activity alone is not the answer. In addition, wrote Washington, you must have property, industry, skill, economy, intelligence, and character. Where Washington wanted to focus on self-determination through independent black schools and businesses, Du Bois argued that civil rights are more important because political power is necessary to protect any economic gains." Now, I do want to point out that these authors were writing at the beginning of the 20th century, a time where there really were structural forces imposed that prevented black progress. So this was the era of Jim Crow segregation. And so I don't think Du Bois was entirely wrong. But what's happened is his ideas are then superimposed on the post-civil rights era, such that in CRT more the focus is still on top-down structural policy solutions as opposed to the strategy promoted by Booker T. Washington, which involves personal responsibility and socioeconomic uplift. This same idea is also later expressed by President Lyndon B. Johnson in a quote that is frequently brought up in CRT literature. In his commencement address to Howard University, which is a historically black college, he had these words to say: "You do not take a person who, for years, has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. Thus, it is not enough just to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. This is the next and the more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not just freedom, but opportunity. We seek not just legal equity, but human ability, not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result." Notice what President Johnson is doing here. He's directly tying this idea of structural determinism to the value of equality of outcomes. Now, this idea has been critiqued by several thinkers in the years since. In particular, I'm going to highlight a quote by Shelby Steele, author of the book White Guilt. Now, in this book, Shelby Steele frequently critiques a concept that he calls social determinism. And when he uses that term, he's essentially saying the same thing that CRT scholars mean by structural determinism. So here's the quote from his book. "It was social determinism that made global racism possible. Determinism was the idea that moved racism from the level of discriminatory events to the level of impersonal and structural forces that worked by invisible hand to stifle black aspiration, even when real racists were nowhere to be seen." So you're going to see the connection here between structural determinism and systemic racism. When racism is defined as a determinism, then whites and American institutions are part of a cultural pattern, white privilege, that automatically oppresses blacks, and blacks are automatically victims of this same pattern. Now notice what Shelby Steele has explicitly done here. He's tied this idea of what he calls social determinism to the notion of white privilege, which is a very commonly used concept in CRT and anti-racist discourse today. And you can see the connection between this notion of privilege and determinism. Basically, if you succeed in life, according to structural determinism, that is simply a result of structural forces that were in your favor that had nothing to do with you. Likewise, if you don't succeed, that's because structural forces were stacked against you. Now, I am not actually denying this notion of white privilege. I actually do think it explains some degree of the racial inequalities in America today. However, I would dispute the CRT claim or the anti-racist claim that it is the primary cause of racial inequalities in America today. I'm going to share a couple more quotes from you that I got from the book Taboo by Wilfred Riley, who is an African-American political scientist, and I believe he teaches in Kentucky, if I remember right. This is one of the best books that I read in 2021 on the topic of racial justice, so I would highly recommend this book if you're interested in more reading on this topic. But in this book, Riley quotes from author Dennis Prager, who in a 2016 National Review article talked about what he calls the fallacy of white privilege. And here's what Prager has to say about a more significant form of privilege than racial privilege in America today. He says, "There are a host of privileges that dwarf white privilege. A huge one is two-parent privilege. If you are raised by a father and mother, you enter adulthood with more privileges than anyone else in American society, irrespective of race, ethnicity, or sex. That's why the poverty rate among two-parent black families is only 7%. Compare that with a 22% poverty rate among whites in single-parent homes. Obviously, the two-parent home is the decisive privilege." I cannot emphasize that point enough. Notice what Prager is saying here, and other studies have shown this as well. If an African American child is raised by both biological parents, they have only a 1 in 14 chance of growing up in poverty. On the other hand, a white child that's raised in a single-parent home has a closer to 1 in 4 chance of growing up in poverty. That is a huge difference, and that does not receive enough attention in discussion today on CRT and anti-racism, at least by its proponents. And this goes a long way towards explaining a lot of the racial disparities in America today. Because the fact is, the rate of single-parent homes is much higher among African Americans than it is among white Americans. According to the most recent studies and surveys that I've seen, the fatherless rate or the single-parent home rate among African Americans is about 70%. Contrast that with the rate of fatherlessness or single-parent homes among white Americans, that's about 25%, maybe a little bit higher now. And so we're talking what? That's like a 45 percentage point gap. That is astounding. And here's what Riley has to say about that gap. It is no exaggeration to say that perhaps 60% of contemporary income, IQ, and incarceration gaps between blacks and whites are due solely to the contemporary surge in father-absent families. All that to show that of all the types of privilege that exist in society today, one of the most important is being raised by both biological parents. Now, a question was raised in my class this morning, but wait a minute. Can't we say that the high rate of fatherlessness among African Americans is itself the result of oppressive social structures like slavery and segregation? And my response to that question was, it's actually not quite that simple. Because if you look at the fatherlessness rate among African Americans in the first half of the 20th century, it's considerably lower. In fact, some studies showed that the fatherlessness rate was actually lower among African Americans than it was among white Americans at the turn of the 20th century. But that changed drastically beginning in the 1960s. And what happened in the 1960s, that's when we had the implementation of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, like the welfare system. As it was originally implemented, it was known as AFDC, that is Aid to Families with Dependent Children. And that system actually incentivized fatherlessness because it provided welfare benefits to a mother as long as she didn't marry the child's father. That sort of system created the incentives that encouraged higher and higher rates of fatherlessness among African Americans. And so the fatherlessness rate was about 25% among African Americans in the 1960s. And even at that point, people were starting to sound alarms about that. So there was the famous Moynihan report, for example, where Daniel Patrick Moynihan, I think he was like the Assistant Secretary of Labor at the time, he highlighted the problem of fatherlessness in black homes. But that was at a time when it was only about 25%. Now it's launched to 70%. And I would also add, white Americans have now caught up to that rate of fatherlessness that was sounding alarms for black families in the 1960s. So this should be troubling for everyone in American society, whether you are white or black. We have an epidemic of fatherlessness going on right now, and that goes a long way towards predicting success or the lack thereof among Americans today. Another point that I want to highlight about structural determinism is in how it understands the relationship of merit and privilege. And so I'm getting this material from Thomas Sowell's essay, The Quest for Cosmic Justice. He doesn't use the term structural determinism, but he's referring to what he calls cosmic justice, which is this idea to provide redress for inequalities in our society that exist apart from anybody's conscious intention. So the reality that people have unequal access to opportunities in life understandably results in some people's desire to correct those inequalities through some means of compensation to provide benefits to those who are more disadvantaged. So on that understanding, Sowell presents this formula for understanding merit according to structural determinism. On these terms, merit is thought to be productivity over privilege. So think about what that means. The performance that a person is capable of in their life, what they're actually able to produce, divided by the amount of privilege that they experience or are socialized into. That determines the merit that a person is truly worthy of according to structural determinist terms. And Sowell highlights some profound difficulties with this understanding of rewarding merit. Now, on the traditional view, you simply merit productivity, period. But here it's seen as a function of both productivity and privilege. And here's the problem with that understanding, according to Sowell. In short, two intractable obstacles stand in the way of rewarding merit. First, and most fundamentally, we do not know how to do it. While we may be able to surmise from a few dramatic examples that personal merit need not correspond with reward, we have no generally applicable way to know how much of each individual's success or failure was due to such windfall gains as innate ability, a favorable upbringing, family wealth, or simply being caught in the right place at the right time, and how much was due to personal merits as hard work and sacrifice. Moreover, even the latter virtues are often to some extent a consequence of upbringing. But even if we could somehow miraculously acquire the omniscience to know all these things and how they interact in complex ways, we would still be left with the fact that changing rewards today changes incentives tomorrow, not just for those benefiting from unmerited good fortune, but for millions of others in the same society. As I've mentioned in previous lessons in this class, the first rule of economics is there's no such thing as a free lunch. Often, efforts to reward merit according to privilege end up creating incentive structures that cause more harm than good. And so that is something that we need to be mindful of when we talk about notions of privilege in society today. There's also another important consideration to keep in mind when we talk about what is it that actually produces success in American society today. There have been several studies that show it's actually not extraordinarily difficult to rise out of poverty in America. In fact, we can boil it down to 3 simple rules. And these rules, if they are followed in order, have a 94 to 98% chance of increasing a person's likelihood of rising out of poverty. So what are those 3 simple rules? Number 1, it's finish high school. Number 2, get a full-time job. And number 3, get married before having kids. If you follow those rules in that order, you are highly likely to rise out of poverty. And it does not require Herculean effort to follow those rules. Now, a question was raised in the class this morning. Now, what about the quality of a person's high school education? Does it matter whether or not they graduate with a high GPA or a low GPA, or what is their reading proficiency upon high school graduation? Well, the statistics that I've looked at don't actually take those things into consideration. All they look at is, did the person graduate from high school? So if we're simply looking at that metric, plus did they get a full-time job, plus did they get married before having kids, this is the formula for success. This is sometimes known as the success sequence. And this was actually talked about by Ian Rowe, who is the CEO of a charter school network in New York City. He was a guest speaker on a panel discussion hosted by the Manhattan Institute, in which they talked about barriers to black progress. And he had these words to say. There's this obsession with the bleak outcomes, particularly in the black community. But there is a story of success. There's actually a growing class of successful black men. These men followed what is often referred to as the success sequence, which is what I just talked about on the previous slide. There are a couple other points in addition to the success sequence, which is that military involvement was sometimes correlated to success, as well as having a faith commitment. But one of the number one elements was that these men had a sense of personal agency, that they felt that their decisions actually had the greatest influence over their personal destiny. That's extraordinary. And so, if you're a kid and you keep hearing over and over and over that because of your race, these are the outcomes that you're going to have in life, it's really hard to feel a sense of personal agency. And here's one of the fundamental problems with structural determinism. It's not that they claim that structural forces sometimes exert an influence on personal choices. That's true. But the problem is when structural determinism becomes a form of fatalism that denies people's personal agency. When it's treated in that way, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if a person believes that the system is rigged against them, that's going to diminish the likelihood that they will exert the necessary effort or make the choices necessary in order to achieve success in society. And so that, I think, is the fundamental danger in this understanding of structural determinism. Another point of critique against structural determinism would be a theological one. Now, as philosophers understand Calvinist theology, they categorize it as a form of compatibilism. Compatibilism is simply the idea that determinism of whatever form is somehow compatible with people still being held morally responsible for their choices. Now, within the Calvinist theological framework, God has foreordained everything that comes to pass, including people's personal choices. And yet, Calvinism still teaches that people are ultimately held responsible for the choices they make in life. And I'm going to highlight just 3 biblical examples that show this point. Pharaoh, King Saul, and Judas. Let's read what Exodus 4:21 says about Pharaoh. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Notice something. The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. And the Apostle Paul actually talked about this same point in Romans chapter 9. Some people would object, yeah, but didn't Pharaoh harden his own heart first, and that's why God hardened his heart? That's actually the opposite of the point that Paul is making in Romans 9, though. Paul does not say that God hardens only those who first harden themselves. Paul says that God has the right to harden whomever he chooses. And now when we look at King Saul, we read these words. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. 1 Samuel 16:14. Now notice something. Could King Saul blame the Lord for having his spirit depart from him and then sending a harmful spirit to torment him? Can Saul say, it's not my fault what I did because this harmful spirit was tormenting me? No. King Saul was still ultimately responsible for his own choices. And then we can look at the example of Judas. Luke 22:3 states, Then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. Now, I don't think that on Judgment Day, Judas is going to be able to say, the devil made me do it. Judas will still be held responsible for the choices that he made, regardless of whatever influences were ordained by God. And so this is the biblical or Calvinistic understanding of compatibilism, and I think this is one of the fundamental problems with structural determinism. They are right to point out that structural forces do sometimes exert an influence on us. They don't always accurately describe what those forces are or how they work, but that part is true enough. But that does not mean that people are therefore not responsible, or at least less responsible for the choices they make. Let me wrap this up by going back to the parable of Meridel and Parker. And let me try and highlight what I think are some of the problems or some of the things that a person could miss after reading this parable. Now, in fairness, I do want to point out that Emerson and Smith are not prescribing policy solutions, so they're not necessarily openly advocating redistributivist policies. But I think a person could naturally infer that from this parable. And so I just want to point out the fact that we have to recognize how wealth actually works in society, because wealth is created, it's not distributed. A lot of times, especially in progressive ideologies, wealth is understood to be like this pre-existing pie that each person gets a share of. And so that if one person gets more of a share of it than another, that's an injustice. But that's not how wealth creation actually works. Wealth is actually created by people. And wealth redistribution actually disincentivizes wealth creation. This has been the problem that has historically plagued every planned economy that has ever been attempted around the world. Because the fact is that if you have wealth redistributivist policies, what happens is those who are not producing wealth no longer have the incentive to try to produce wealth. And those who are producing wealth, if they aren't able to enjoy the rewards of their productivity, they're going to have less of an incentive to produce more wealth. So across the board, wealth redistribution tends to diminish the amount of wealth created within a society. That's one problem. Another problem, which I've already mentioned, is sort of the compatibilist issue. Attributing racial inequalities to only either individualist causes like lack of willpower or structural causes like institutional discrimination is a false dichotomy. You can recognize that there are structural causes and yet still hold people responsible for the choices that they make in society. But in addition to that, I think there's more than just individual causes and structural causes going on. We also have to look at how culture is a significant causal influence on an individual's beliefs, behaviors, and actions. Now, in the book Divided by Faith, Emerson and Smith actually don't treat culture as a separate category of its own. They sort of dismiss it as simply aggregated individualism, which I don't think is quite accurate. I think the way culture operates is different from solely individualistic factors. And so we need to take culture seriously, because culture is what produces certain family values and produces certain educational values that go a long way towards predicting a person's success in society today. So that is my summary of our lesson today on structural determinism. I know we covered a ton of ground today, and I know it's probably raised a lot of questions, but I'm hoping to come back to some of these ideas in future lessons. But if you who are watching this video or listening to the recording have any questions or comments about this, feel free to post a comment on the YouTube channel or to contact me directly, and I'd be happy to address any questions or comments that you have. So thank you very much, and God bless.